Martin Scorsese's The Aviator shows Howard Hughes crashing into Beverly Hills in a horrifying plane accident. What the film doesn't show you is that this wasn't even his worst crash, and it certainly wasn't the only time his obsessions nearly killed him. The real Howard Hughes was far darker, more complicated, and more tragic than Leonardo DiCaprio's portrayal suggests. The Aviator, released in 2004, brought Howard Hughes back into the cultural spotlight. Directed by Martin Scorsese and starring Leonardo DiCaprio, the film chronicles Hughes's life from the late 1920s through 1947, focusing on his achievements in aviation and filmmaking, his struggles with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and his relationships with Hollywood's most famous women. The film earned 11 Academy Award nominations and won 5, including Best Supporting Actress for Cate Blanchett's portrayal of Katharine Hepburn. But how much of what you saw on screen actually happened? Today we're diving deep into the true story behind The Aviator, what the film got right, what it changed, and what it deliberately left out. Some of these omissions are shocking, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why the real Howard Hughes was someone even Hollywood couldn't fully capture. Let's start at the beginning. The film opens with young Howard Hughes being bathed by his mother, who obsessively warns him about disease while teaching him to spell quarantine. This scene immediately establishes the origin of Hughes's germophobia and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Here's what's accurate. Howard Hughes's mother, Aline Stone Gano Hughes, was indeed overprotective and deeply concerned about disease. According to historical accounts, she checked him daily for signs of illness, was cautious about what he ate, and often had him sleep in her bedroom. She frequently pulled him out of boarding school or summer camp early because of her health anxieties. However, the specific bathing ritual shown in the film, with the ominous tone and the spelling lesson, never actually happened. It's a dramatic invention to visually communicate the psychological foundation of Hughes's later mental health struggles. The scene also exaggerates his mother's neuroticism to an almost psychotic degree, when in reality, she was simply an overprotective mother of an only child during an era when diseases like typhoid and cholera were genuine threats. What the film leaves out entirely is that Hughes's OCD might not have stemmed from his mother at all. Many experts believe his mental decline was actually caused by the multiple traumatic head injuries he suffered throughout his life, from plane and car crashes. In fact, author Karina Longworth has suggested that Hughes's brain was fundamentally changed by head injuries that weren't understood at the time. He also may have suffered from allodynia, a condition that makes ordinary sensations painful, which could explain why he often refused to wear clothes later in life. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about how Hughes became Howard Hughes. The Aviator begins with adult Howard Hughes during the production of Hell's Angels, portraying him as a naive but idealistic filmmaker completely new to the movie business. The film makes it seem like this was his first major project. That's not quite accurate. By the time Hughes started Hell's Angels, he had already produced the Academy Award-winning comedy Two Arabian Nights in 1927. He wasn't a complete novice. He already had some experience and credibility in Hollywood. The film also omits Hughes's disastrous first attempt at filmmaking. His very first project was financing and producing a short film called Swell Hogan in the mid-1920s. After screening it, Hughes thought it was so terrible that he ordered the entire film destroyed. His uncle, Rupert Hughes, a successful screenwriter and film director, actually tried to discourage Howard from pursuing more film projects, fearing he would waste his family fortune. Hughes ignored this advice, demonstrating the stubborn determination that would define his entire life. Another major omission, Hughes was married during the production of Hell's Angels. In 1925, at age 19, he married Ella Botts Rice, and the newlyweds moved to Los Angeles together to pursue his film career. The film doesn't mention this marriage at all. Instead, The Aviator portrays Hughes as a bachelor during the Hell's Angels years, presumably to simplify the narrative and focus on his later, more famous relationships. Now let's talk about Hell's Angels itself, because the true story of that production could be its own film. The Aviator accurately depicts Hell's Angels as a massively expensive and troubled production. Hughes spent 3 years obsessively working on the film and financed it entirely himself. Approximately $3.5 million, which would be roughly $63 million today. The film shows Hughes crashing a plane while trying to capture aerial footage. That part is true, but here's what the film doesn't tell you. 3 pilots and 1 mechanic were killed during the making of Hell's Angels. These weren't minor accidents. Real people died to bring Hughes's vision to life. Today, a tragedy like this would shut down a production immediately, as happened with Deadpool 2 when a stunt person was killed. But Hughes persevered, driven by his obsession to create the ultimate aerial war film. The film accurately shows Hughes witnessing the jazz singer in 1927 and deciding to reshoot Hell's Angels with sound. However, it implies he reshot the entire film, when in reality, only partial reshoots took place. The film also omits several fascinating details. Hughes fired the original female star, Greta Nissen, because her Norwegian accent was deemed unsuitable for talkies, and replaced her with the unknown Jean Harlow. He also brought in James Whale, who would later direct Frankenstein, to reshoot the dialogue scenes, because Hughes himself wasn't skilled at directing actors. During this period, Hughes even filed a lawsuit against a rival war film, The Dawn Patrol, fearing it would overshadow his epic. Hell's Angels did eventually become a moderate success, though it took years to recoup its massive budget. But it established Hughes as a serious player in Hollywood. And that's when his darker patterns with women began. This is where The Aviator makes some of its most significant omissions. The film does show Hughes as a playboy with a reputation for dating famous actresses. You see his relationships with Katharine Hepburn, played by Cate Blanchett, and Ava Gardner, played by Kate Beckinsale. There's even a brief, ominous scene where Hughes seems to audition young actresses as potential romantic interests. But the reality was far more disturbing, and more recent research, particularly Karina Longworth's book Seduction, has revealed just how manipulative and controlling Hughes truly was. Here's the pattern Hughes repeated over and over. He would meet a young, aspiring actress and sign her to a contract with his production company. But instead of securing them acting roles, he would assert total control over not just their careers, but their entire lives. He wanted ownership over these women, whether he was actively involved with them or not. If they disobeyed him or tried to work with other studios, he would threaten to destroy their careers. Many of these women saw their promising futures derailed because they were essentially imprisoned by contracts with a man who refused to let them work. The film barely hints at this. Instead, it focuses on his relationships with Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner, 2 strong, independent women who could stand up to Hughes. While these portrayals add dramatic tension, they give viewers a misleadingly sanitized view of Hughes's treatment of women. Let's talk specifically about what the film changed and omitted regarding these 2 relationships. Kate Beckinsale portrays Ava Gardner as a fiery, independent woman who challenges Hughes's controlling behavior. There is a scene where Gardner confronts Hughes about bugging her house, and their relationship is shown as contentious. But here's what the film deliberately left out. Howard Hughes and Ava Gardner once had a violent physical fight in Louis B. Mayer's office. During this altercation, Hughes dislocated Gardner's jaw, and she hit him over the head with a large glass ashtray, causing blood to spatter on the walls and furniture. MGM studio boss Louis B. Mayer immediately called in his staff to hustle Gardner away and clean up the mess to avoid negative press. Astonishingly, Hughes later asked her to marry him. Ava Gardner also claimed that Hughes was racist, an aspect of his character never touched upon in the film. She said she never actually loved him, but her voice and her experiences are largely muted in Scorsese's sympathetic portrayal of a lonely, troubled man. This omission is significant. By not showing Hughes's alleged violence against Gardner, the film avoids complicating the audience's sympathy for him. It presents him as a flawed genius struggling with mental illness, rather than someone who may have also been abusive. And this brings us to one of the most shocking omissions in the entire film. On July 11, 1936, Howard Hughes struck and killed a pedestrian named Gabriel S. Meyer with his car at the corner of 3rd Street and Lorraine in Los Angeles. After the crash, Hughes was taken to the hospital and certified as sober, but an attending doctor noted that Hughes had been drinking. A witness told police that Hughes was driving erratically and too fast, and that Meyer had been standing in the safety zone of a streetcar stop. Hughes was booked on suspicion of negligent homicide and held overnight in jail. However, by the time of the coroner's inquest, the witness had mysteriously changed his story, claiming that Meyer had stepped directly in front of Hughes's car. The woman in the car with Hughes corroborated this new version. Hughes was held blameless, and the case was closed. The Aviator never mentions this incident at all. Including it would have introduced moral ambiguity around Hughes's character and raised uncomfortable questions about his wealth and power, and whether he used them to escape consequences. But fatal accidents weren't the only tragedies surrounding Hughes. Let's talk about his plane crashes. The film's most memorable sequence is the 1946 crash of the XF-11 spy plane in Beverly Hills. Leonardo DiCaprio's performance in this scene is visceral and intense. The film accurately depicts the horror of the crash, including Hughes's life-threatening injuries, a crushed collarbone, multiple cracked ribs, a collapsed lung that shifted his heart to the right side of his chest, and severe burns. The film also shows Marine Master Sergeant William L. Durkin rescuing Hughes from the wreckage. According to reports, Hughes sent Durkin a check for $200 every month for the rest of his life as a thank you. However, Durkin's daughter later denied that her father received any such payments, so this detail remains disputed. What the film doesn't show is that Hughes was involved in 4 major plane crashes during his life, not just the XF-11 accident, and one of those crashes was fatal, not for Hughes, but for others. In May 1943, Hughes was test flying a Sikorsky S-43 amphibious aircraft on Lake Mead, preparing for the eventual flight of the H-4 Hercules, also known as the Spruce Goose. On board were 2 Civil Aeronautics Authority inspectors, 2 of Hughes's employees, and actress Ava Gardner. After dropping Gardner off in Las Vegas, Hughes proceeded to Lake Mead for test flights. During one of these tests, the Sikorsky crashed into the lake, killing CAA Inspector Seco Klein and Hughes's employee Richard Felt. Hughes suffered a severe gash on his head but survived. Why didn't the Aviator include this crash? Likely because it would have undercut the dramatic power of the Beverly Hills crash and raised questions about Hughes's competence as a pilot. By focusing only on the XF-11 accident, where Hughes was the sole victim, the film maintains sympathy for him as a tragic figure, rather than someone whose recklessness endangered and killed others. There's also the 1936 car accident I mentioned earlier, which resulted in a pedestrian's death. Between plane crashes and vehicular accidents, Hughes left a trail of destruction and death, far more than the film acknowledges. And then there's the question of Hughes's mental health, which the film does address but not entirely accurately. The Aviator does a commendable job showing Hughes's obsessive-compulsive disorder. We see him repeatedly washing his hands, refusing to touch doorknobs, obsessing over the placement of peas on his plate, and spiraling into compulsive repetition of phrases like "show me the blueprints." These depictions are based on real behaviors. One of the film's most harrowing sequences shows Hughes locked in a screening room, unwashed and deteriorating, urinating into glass milk bottles while surrounded by tissues. This did happen, but the timeline is wrong. In the film, this breakdown occurs around 1946 to 1947, just before the Senate hearings, and Hughes manages to pull himself together in time to testify and salvage his reputation. In reality, Hughes's infamous 4-month isolation in a screening room happened in 1958, more than a decade after the events shown in the film. The movie compresses his mental decline to fit within the narrative time frame and to create a dramatic arc where Hughes temporarily overcomes his disorder for one final triumph. In truth, Hughes's obsessive-compulsive disorder only worsened over time. He became increasingly reclusive, eventually living in the top floors of hotels for years at a time, refusing to see anyone, and communicating only through written memos. His hygiene deteriorated so badly that hotel employees who entered his room after he left discovered that his drapes had rotted through because they hadn't been opened in years. The film ends on an ominous note, with Hughes repeating "the way of the future" over and over, suggesting that his problems will persist. But it doesn't show just how completely his mental illness would consume the final decades of his life. Now let's talk about one of the film's climactic moments. the Senate hearings. The Aviator portrays the 1947 Senate hearings as a triumphant underdog victory for Hughes. Senator Owen Brewster, played by Alan Alda, accuses Hughes of being a war profiteer who wasted government money on planes that were never delivered to the military. Hughes, in a moment of dramatic brilliance, turns the tables and accuses Brewster of being bribed by Pan Am founder Juan Trippe to destroy his competitor, Trans World Airlines. This sequence is thrilling and largely true. Hughes did accuse Brewster of being on Pan Am's payroll, and the hearings were widely interpreted as a Hughes victory. However, some historians allege that Hughes's bribery accusations were fabricated to save his own image and shift public attention away from his failures to deliver on military contracts. There's another inaccuracy. In the film, Brewster chairs the hearing. In reality, the hearing was chaired by Michigan Senator Homer Ferguson. This change was made to condense characters and create a clear antagonist for Hughes to overcome. The film also omits the fact that Hughes's feud with Brewster didn't end with the hearing. 5 years later, in 1952, Hughes persuaded the governor of Maine to run against Brewster in the Senate primary, and Hughes provided $60,000 to the campaign. Brewster lost, effectively ending his political career. Hughes could hold a grudge. But there's one more massive thing the film left out, something that reveals just how eccentric and unpredictable Hughes truly was. In the early 1930s, Howard Hughes, one of the wealthiest men in America, used the alias Charles Howard to get a job as a baggage handler for American Airlines. He was soon promoted to co-pilot. Hughes was living a secret double life as a commercial airline employee, and he kept it up until his real identity was discovered. Why isn't this in the film? Probably because it would have felt like a fun diversion that didn't serve the main narrative. It also might have reminded audiences too much of Leonardo DiCaprio's earlier role in Catch Me If You Can, where he played conman Frank Abagnale, who similarly assumed false identities. But this anecdote reveals something important about Hughes. He was obsessed with aviation, not just as a businessman or an engineer, but as someone who genuinely loved flying and wanted to experience it from every angle, even if it meant scrubbing luggage. Let's wrap up with what happened to Hughes after the film ends. The Aviator concludes in 1947, with Hughes still a powerful and relatively functional figure. But the film only covers roughly 20 years of his life. Hughes lived for nearly 30 more years, and those years were marked by increasing isolation, paranoia, and physical deterioration. He eventually married actress Jean Peters in 1957. Their marriage lasted 14 years, but they spent most of that time living separately. Peters filed for divorce in 1970 and famously refused to ever discuss her life with Hughes, even turning down lucrative offers from publishers. She would only say that she hadn't seen Hughes for several years before their divorce and had only communicated with him by phone. By the 1960s, Hughes was living in the top-floor penthouses of hotels in Las Vegas, Boston, Vancouver, the Bahamas, and Nicaragua. He refused to cut his hair or nails, reportedly because the sensation was too painful due to his undiagnosed nerve damage. He stored his urine in bottles. He watched movies obsessively, particularly Ice Station Zebra, which his aides claimed he watched 150 times. He also repeatedly watched The Conqueror, a film he had produced that was both a critical and commercial failure, and which was filmed downwind from nuclear test sites, leading many cast and crew members to later develop cancer. Hughes became addicted to codeine, which he injected intramuscularly to manage chronic pain from his plane crashes. When he died on April 5, 1976, at age 70, he was virtually unrecognizable. His 6'4" frame weighed only 90 pounds. His hair, beard, fingernails, and toenails were grotesquely long. The FBI had to use fingerprints to identify him. An autopsy revealed 5 broken-off hypodermic needles embedded in his arms. Despite his physical ruin, his brain showed no visible damage or illness. His other internal organs were healthy. The official cause of death was kidney failure, but an 18-month investigation into his drug abuse concluded that someone had likely administered a fatal injection of painkillers to Hughes while he was comatose, an injection that was obviously needlessly and almost certainly fatal. Howard Hughes died alone, on a plane, en route to a hospital. It was a lonely, tragic end for a man who had once been one of the most powerful and influential figures in the world. The Aviator is a beautifully crafted film that captures the ambition, brilliance, and the tragedy of Howard Hughes. Leonardo DiCaprio delivers a powerful performance, and Martin Scorsese's direction brings the golden age of Hollywood and aviation to life with stunning visual artistry. But the film also makes a deliberate choice. It presents Hughes as a flawed but ultimately sympathetic genius, a victim of mental illness and circumstance. To do so, it omits some of the darkest aspects of his life: the deaths caused by his recklessness, the alleged violence against Ava Gardner, the manipulative and controlling treatment of young actresses, the mysterious car accident that killed a pedestrian. The real Howard Hughes was more complicated, more tragic, and more morally ambiguous than the film suggests. He was a visionary who pushed the boundaries of aviation and cinema. He was also a man who left destruction in his wake, who used his wealth and power to control and silence others, and who ultimately succumbed to the mental illness and addiction that consumed his final years. The Aviator gives us a Howard Hughes we can root for. The real Howard Hughes is harder to admire, but far more fascinating. If you found this deep dive into the true story behind The Aviator fascinating, you're going to love this channel. I create detailed, research-driven comparisons of true story films and what really happened, uncovering the shocking omissions, the dramatic changes, and the real people behind the legends. If you're the kind of person who watches a movie and immediately wonders, but what actually happened? This is the channel for you. Subscribe now so you never miss a video, and let me know in the comments which true story film you want me to cover next. Thanks for watching.